Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Laith Abu-Raddad, who is a professor of population health sciences at Cornell University in Qatar. He is also the director of the WHO Collaborating Center for Disease Analytics on HIV, sexually transmitted infections, and viral hepatitis. Previously, he held academic and research positions at the University of Washington, Imperial College London, and Osaka University. Welcome, Laith.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to have this discussion today.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you had a number of papers on this very topical area of COVID pandemic that many countries are struggling with, multiple waves of the problems. Different countries appear to be in different states of dealing with it. And I want to start with one of your papers characterizing the Qatar COVID epidemic, advanced phase SARS-CoV-2 epidemic. We call it COVID in short form. Mm-hmm. And Qatar, obviously in the Gulf, has a population of about 3 million, over half of whom are, you say, expatriate craft and manual workers. As an aside, Laith, I grew up in a southern state of India called Kerala. Mm-hmm. And I think a large proportion of those people actually come from that state. And so I know that population reasonably well. We aim to characterize severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, COVID epidemic in Qatar. So this is sort of focusing on that population, right? So what is the data that you used and what do you find?
Sure. Yeah, so this article is in reality a compilation of several epidemiologic studies.
Yeah.
So we try to provide the descriptive epidemiology of the epidemic in Qatar. So also just to give background in relation to our setting. So as you just indicated, almost 90% of the population of Qatar are expatriates who are in the country coming here for work. It's a country that has a very dynamic economy and is going through a very rapid economic development and actually social development as well. So this is why we have a very large expatriate population. Now, as a result of this, actually, the elderly population here is very small. Less than 9% of the population are above 50 years of age, and less than 2% are above 60 years of age.
Oh, wow.
So, so it's a very, very young population. I mean, mostly really people in working age. This is really our population.
Right.
So this is why, this is actually one of our strengths in facing this epidemic.
Yeah.
That we don't have that much of an elderly population, which are the most affected by the morbidity and mortality of this infection. On the other hand, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, on the other hand, we do have actually a vulnerability here, which is the large craft and manual worker population. The reason for this vulnerability, because typically this population consists of single young men who live together in accommodations that are shared.
Yeah.
So typically a given accommodation, which is more like a dorm really, includes hundreds, sometimes even thousands. I mean, you're talking about big housing complex that houses tens of thousands of even potentially workers in multiple buildings that are all together. Usually these workers, they share rooms, they share bathrooms, they have meals together, often in a cafeteria style setting. Now, why this is a vulnerability? Because we know from influenza epidemiology what's known as the boarding school effect.
Yeah.
Such settings, because you have large number of people living together, where they interact with each other on a daily basis, then it's very easy for a respiratory infection to propagate very quickly in such setting. And this is what we saw also for COVID. For example, in Europe, much of the mortality, actually about half, occurred in centers which actually care centers for the elderly. Yeah, so because these have the same actually vulnerability. Yeah, so this is really the vulnerability we had in Qatar. And indeed, this population was the most affected population by the epidemic here.
Yeah, so it's a very sort of interesting lab experiment in the sense that very small population of 3 million with characteristics that are not typical of other countries, very young population, but they're also sort of interacting fairly close together. And so we don't really have that in many parts of the world. And so so there are a lot of hypotheses around, so the case fatality in the first wave was significantly different from the second and third waves. Some of it is, in the Western countries, some of it is probably due to the denominator effect, because younger people are more in the denominator in the second and third waves than the first one. And then the clinical protocols seem to have improved. So we know how to sort of treat severely ill patients as well. So that all is kind of feeding into the case mortality decline. But so based on the studies that you have done and others have done in that population, what are the most interesting features that you find?
Well, actually, you alluded, in fact, exactly to one. I would say the most fascinating aspect of our epidemic here is the very low severity. So, in fact, we are right now finalizing a study that exactly characterizes both the disease severity and the disease fatality in our population, and by age group.
Yeah.
And what we found is that there is a very strong age dependence for both disease and for fatality. It grows very, very rapidly with age. It is really, it can be reached quite high values relatively for the elderly population, but it's very small for the young population. And especially the critical forms of the disease. I mean, by a disease that requires an ICU treatment.
Yeah.
These forms and fatality are very, very low for those below 50 years of age. So now, given that our population really mostly is just very young population, and even after accounting for the denominator of all infections in the population, because we have done actually antibody testing, lots of antibody testing here, we found very low severity. So for example, fatality was only, and it's really very fascinating, was only 2 per 10,000 in our population.
2 in 10,000. So
2 in 10,000.
Is that
actually
even lower than what you see in sort of traditional flu?
No, I would say no. It's still actually overall higher than 50.
Okay.
No, it is actually.
Okay.
Now, the reason, well, here, why it's very low here, because of the age structure of the population.
Yeah.
We simply don't have the elderly population, very small of it. And also, this population wasn't much affected by the epidemic here. It was really well protected in our epidemic. Part of it because, in fact, the culture was supported.
Yeah.
I mean, our elderly population lives in homes with their families, and Qatar has the highest per capita income in the world. So they live really in excellent housing. It's not like congested housing and so on. So the elderly wasn't really much affected, fortunately, by the epidemic, and most of our population are young. So if we compare these rates, let's say, to influenza in the US, they are actually comparable. But this is not. But these are not really fair comparisons,
right?
Because it's in the US you have a significant fraction of the population above 60 years of age.
Right. And so it's interesting. You have an extension, another paper here. Age could be driving variable in COVID epidemic trajectories worldwide. And so you're sort of taking the Qatar data and looking across the world to see if you can see some patterns, right? So what does that study find?
Yeah, so this is in fact was exactly as you indicated. Because of our experience here.
Yeah.
I mean, what we saw is a very different epidemic compared to what was observed in Europe and the US. We simply did not have that level of severity. I mean, the total number of deaths we had is just over 230 deaths so far.
Yeah.
And our epidemic is really in a low incidence phase right now. So it's really very striking how low it is. So this really compelled us to look further into this. And indeed, through this study, when we projected the mortality rates the age-specific mortality rates, applied them into different population demographic structures around the world, we immediately saw there must be very different mortality rates globally by this infection, just simply because of the fraction of the elderly population.
Right.
So, and this is really why I think we are seeing a pretty very serious epidemic, let's say, in the US, and I think now it's well above 200,000 deaths in the US, but really in countries which are ill-equipped to deal with the epidemic. They are not seeing actually that much mortality. Let me take Syria, for example. It's a country that's, in a civil war, so the epidemic must be expanding rapidly over there. But actually, it doesn't look like it generated much mortality. Africa is another example, because Africa is the youngest, population in the world.
Yeah.
The epidemic is expanding, but really mortality has been really, really low. So this is basically a core idea for this study, is to see how the epidemic could be evolving in different paths globally.
Okay, so if you do a model, what you are concluding here is that age is a very dominant factor in that model to predict mortality. But there is also an interesting observation here, like which is about the sort of the dynamics of infection, how fast and how much, right? That's also interesting. That's also driven by age, it looks like.
Yes, in fact, this is the other thing we wanted to look at. And this started when we did a study to model the epidemic in China. Now, if we take the China data, we see a very strong also effect for susceptibility to the infection by age group. We see quite low exposure to the infection among among children, very, very low exposure rate, and we see much higher rates among the elderly. So this brought the question: could it be that really there is even the susceptibility to the infection varies by age group? Now, this pattern, by the way, is exactly the opposite of what we would expect for a cold virus. Typically, even the other common cold coronaviruses, they tend to affect mostly children
Right.
and affect less the elderly. The older people, not only the older
Yeah.
people. Other than children. This is exactly the opposite, it
Well,
seems.
yeah.
Yeah.
So disease susceptibility
Mhm.
is also lower in children. And so if you
Correct.
put all these sorts of observations together, you will find countries with lower average age are experiencing smaller, and I also find this idea of slower
Uh-huh.
epidemics,
Correct.
right? So that the
Yes.
disease spread is also slower in younger population.
Yeah, these are actually very linked to each
Yeah.
other. Yeah, I'll give you even how we even accidentally discovered this. So when we're doing the modeling for Qatar, then we took exactly the parameters from China. This is how we started, because at the time China was the only epidemic we knew of. This was back in March, and we applied the parameters we derived from the Chinese epidemic to the Qatar epidemic. We actually get a smaller reproduction number in Qatar.
Mhm.
The reproduction number R0 is the most important parameter that will determine the extent of the epidemic and also how fast it will grow.
Yeah.
Only because of these differences in susceptibility to the infection. So absolutely, you are absolutely right. And let's say in an African country where, like Niger, where half of the population is below 15 years of age, and if children are less susceptible to the infection, and even when they get it, they clear it quickly, so they don't spread it as much to other people. The epidemic is going also to spread at a slower
Yeah.
rate, and it's not going to reach the same extent as in other populations.
So, from a policy perspective, Laith, one of the things that we are struggling with in the US is about universities and schools. In the
Mhm.
lab experiment in Qatar, you have a nice situation where the elderly is sort of segregated from the
Mhm.
younger population, and hence you can control it. But in situations where you have intermixed age groups, you still have this problem, right? Granted, both the susceptibility and growth rates are going to be lower in
Mhm.
schools and universities, but they actually come home and then
Mhm.
transmit the disease
Correct.
to parents and grandparents, right? So in an intermixed situation, it doesn't really help from a policy perspective, I would think.
Well, I would say yes and
Okay.
no. Definitely this intergenerational
Yeah.
mixing, uh, of course, is a big challenge, and it appears to have been the case in the Italy
Mm.
epidemic, where it's actually believed it was one of the causes for the severity of the epidemic. But really, again, I think it's still there is an opportunity over
Mm.
there. We through proper messaging, we can try to protect the elderly and reduce this vulnerability.
Yeah.
But we take advantage of the fact that younger people may be less susceptible to the infection, and definitely they are less susceptible to severe disease.
Did you get any data on sort of the asymptomatic transmission that, younger people presumably may have a higher percentage of asymptomatic infections too?
Yes, in fact, we believe this is the
Yeah.
case. For example, one of the studies we have done is a nationwide survey to see what's the fraction of people are infected.
Mm.
This is using PCR,
Yeah.
and one of the really very striking finding, and we did this in early May before really the infection epidemiology was clear
Mm.
enough. 58.5% of those who were PCR positive reported no
Mm.
symptom whatsoever
Mm.
in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
We're talking about 58.5%.
Right. So,
I
yeah.
mean, it was really very shocking, to be honest with you. You know, when we got this.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So, what is our understanding about people who are infected but show no symptoms? Are they able to transmit the disease at the same level as somebody who's symptomatic? Do we have any data on that?
I mean, we don't have data from Qatar that are direct regarding
Okay.
this. But indirectly, I think there is very little question that they do transmit. How we know that? Because we looked at the cycle threshold values in those asymptomatic infections, which is really a measure of the viral load. How much viral load do they have?
Yeah.
And they do have very high viral, or some of them do have very high viral load. So clearly, even asymptomatic people do have the potential to spread the infection. Now we have also data from other countries and so on. And it's becoming increasingly clear that asymptomatic people do transmit the infection, and that even much of at least half of the transmission among those who end up becoming symptomatic actually happens before they become symptomatic.
Okay.
So, and this is really why it has been so difficult to control this infection.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
No. So that's fascinating. So I want to touch on another paper, which is also a big topic of conversations across many countries, and that is evidence for the level of herd immunity against COVID infection, the 10 community study. So the background here is Qatar again experienced a large severe COVID epidemic, disproportionately affected the craft and manual workers, as we talked about, and they constitute over 60% of the population. And so the question you're asking here is, we know that the infection rates could be quite high, like the PCR positivity you're saying is close to 60%. So high infection rate, probably high asymptomatic disease state. And so the interesting question would be, what is the sort of the herd immunity targets? And again, it's a nice lab experiment where we could potentially get some insights into this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, you had a
No. So
question?
yeah. So what did you find in terms of herd immunity? What is the level that a community needs to reach before they can, get to a herd immunity level?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a very interesting debated issue currently. So now, if we go with the classic epidemic
Yeah.
theory, the herd immunity threshold is at 60 to 70% attack rate. So 60 to 70% of the population needs to be infected in order for us to reach herd immunity, which is, of course, very, very high
Right.
level. This is based on the reproduction number for this infection. Now, however, several scientists have argued that we may reach herd immunity at lower levels. And part of the reason, because there is heterogeneity in the contact rate in the population, which actually will reduce it. So in this study, we chose 10 different workplace communities. These are big, like complexes that houses workers here in Qatar. And it happened, we know in these two communities, they were severely affected by large outbreaks. So we wanted to see how much really exposure they had. Could it be that they reached herd immunity, given that these severe outbreaks happened? We know it happened over there. And indeed, it turns out 60 to 70% of them were already infected through antibody. And we saw very little active infection over there. So the conclusion is that really, in order to reach herd immunity, at least in such homogeneous populations, we need definitely 60 to 7% exposure rates.
Right.
So based on this study, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, some people have argued we could reach herd immunity by only 15 to 20% of the population. It does not really look so,
Yeah, so that's interesting. So that has been, like you say, has been conventional wisdom. Your data appears to sort of confirm that conventional wisdom. 2/3 of the population. Now, I wondered from a policy perspective again, where there is an intervention that basically, I mean, this is not an experiment we can really realistically run, and that is if the severity and the ability to counteract with the disease is a lot higher at lower age populations, then experimentally at least you can have a thought experiment that says that if the younger population 60, 70, 80% of them are infected, then that population ultimately gets herd immunity. Um, but the problem, obviously, not an experiment we can run. I'm just doing a thought experiment here. The other problem here, I don't know if you have any insights into this, Laith, that we don't really know the long-term effects of COVID, right? So I was told that the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, a million survivors of Spanish flu at that time seems to have developed Parkinson's disease 10 years later, long time later.
Correct. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so when governments and policy professionals think about better policies, we don't really have a good estimate of the disease burden, right? Of this. What are your thoughts on that?
You are absolutely right. We really don't know about the long-term consequences of this infection.
Yeah.
And definitely, as you indicated, we know that the Spanish flu, there were actually consequences that, in fact, were not even discovered till decades later, actually. In fact, they were discovered incidentally when they disappeared. Because when they disappeared, all of a sudden, it was very evident that the population that was the cohort that was affected by these disease disorders happened to be the cohort that lived through that pandemic. So this is how we even establish causality over there. So yeah, we don't know really the long-term effects, but also I think we should not be also exaggerating this. We are talking about really truly rare conditions.
Yes.
And I think similarly here, I mean, this infection is not like a very, very different, so to speak, infection from the kind of infections we had already. In fact, we had several cold coronaviruses that are not very different, from this infection, and we have been experiencing them for many, many years. In fact, I think one of the hypotheses is that one of the currently very mild coronaviruses has its origin, in fact, in a pandemic that happened in the 19th century. And it evolved to be very mild actually right now, and only in a few decades. So eventually COVID may just join the club of those common cold coronaviruses. And really, it doesn't appear that these common cold coronaviruses generate very serious, let's say, or in a high level long-term disease outcomes. So I am more on the conservative side. Let me see. I have to see and follow for long term before really we become too obsessed about this. Now back to your very interesting thought question. If we let's the young people experience the infection in order to protect the elderly, and we reach herd immunity in this way. Well, that's an interesting thought question, definitely. But honestly, now of course there are many issues with such idea ethically, and so on. But honestly, I don't think we need to go that far, because I am pretty convinced that we will have a vaccine soon. Now, why I'm pretty convinced? Because right now we are really at a golden age for vaccine research. I mean, the kind of technologies used right now to develop the vaccines are amazing. Things that we are starting actually for the first time, and they really appear to have a lot of potential. Now, also, one reason for my optimism is, in fact, another study we conducted here, which relates to reinfection. So we have been following the cohort of infected people here in Qatar to see whether they are getting reinfected. And
let me we will come back to that later. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the re-exposure aspect of this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. Late year. So we were talking about COVID-19, sort of a nice experiment in Qatar with 3 million people, very young population, very close together, living conditions, and showing very high infection rate, but very, very low mortality. So age seems to be a driving factor. Of course, for mortality, but also for just susceptibility to disease, because there is also very high levels of asymptomatic disease incidence in that population. So I want to now go into another paper you have in this area. So analyzing inherent biases in COVID PCR and serological epidemiologic metrics, where you say observational data show that infected persons remain PCR positive for a prolonged duration, and detectable antibodies develop slowly with time. So that has a lot of implications, right? Both so when we go out and test, we're going to find high positivity rate, but many of them are probably not going to develop the disease. Is that how I should think about that?
Yeah, this is one way to think about it. Yeah. So this infection has two interesting patterns. The first one, as you indicated, many people actually can stay PCR positive for a very long time. In fact, we have seen here in Qatar, people over 8 weeks, they continue PCR positive. But when we look at the CT value, the cyclic threshold value, which tells us about the viral load, we see very high values, which are indicative of non-replicating virus. So these must be just viral fragments that keep circulating. This is basically the debris that remained from, so to speak, the hurricane that passed through, the body, in dealing with this infection. Billions and billions of viruses were produced, and somehow the system still has a lot of those debris circulating. So the existence of this prolonged PCR positivity complicates epidemiologic measures. We will go, let's say, and do a survey, and we'll see high positivity, but that does not mean, and truly, there is a lot of active infection. In fact, a good fraction of those simply have already cleared the infection, and they are not really at risk of disease, or at least except maybe for long-term consequences.
So what is the reason that antibodies develop slowly with time? Is it the testing protocol issue? I mean, intuitively, I would think that if the body is getting a lot of infection, it would develop antibodies to take care of that infection. But why is that it taking long time to detect those antibodies?
Really, for this infection, it looks like T cells play a very important role in immunity. And if we really think of it evolutionarily speaking, antibodies really are not meant to be primarily to fight a primary infection. They are actually the arsenal that the body develops to prepare itself for future infections by the same virus. The body has other means to fight the infection other than antibodies during primary infection.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the T cells is sort of T cell kind of defense is a little bit different from antibodies, right? So they can also memorize this incidence and get better for future infections.
T cells also do have their own memory. In fact, this is also one of the hypotheses we have for why the severity of the infection here in Qatar has been low because our population is highly, diverse. It's also well traveled. We have lots of travel here.
Yeah.
So it's possible that our populations have had in the past lots of exposure to other common cold coronaviruses. Now we have a growing evidence, really one study after another, that show prior exposures to these common cold viruses create some kind of immune memory, and they cross-react with COVID-19. Now, because of this immune memory, this immune memory may not protect against infection, but appears to protect against disease, because there is already an immune response over there. So when the virus comes, it cannot prevent the infection, but actually it reacts strong enough to prevent progression to more severe disease forms.
Okay. Yeah, I know that you haven't looked into this, but there was another hypothesis about the BCG vaccine, which is the TB vaccine, as you know, and the
Correct.
difference they found in the data between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, as well as South Asian countries. There was a hypothesis that said the BCG vaccination was much more prevalent in those areas, and it seems like mortality rate is much lower. Did you see anything like that in the Qatar population?
We haven't, but really very much our population is all also BCG vaccinated.
Right.
So it's not as easy for us to explore this hypothesis. It's definitely an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah.
I mean, naively, however, I would have been quite skeptical about it, because I mean, BCG is not even effective against TB. I mean, this is really the real. I mean, it's not really that effective against TB. And typically people get it in their childhood. So I mean, by the time they get, I mean, the exposure for COVID happens decades later. So but of course, biology is always surprising, and we may find interesting ways by which this could have actually played a role.
Okay. And so the T cell memory idea that we just talked about, what is your feel about how this is going to develop over the years? So every flu season, we get a different flu. We have to have a different flu vaccine to counteract it. Are we going to get into a situation that we need a COVID vaccine every year? What is your thought?
Oh, excellent question. I mean, and of course, the question that we really don't know what will actually happen.
Yeah.
Now, we know, however, it's quite possible, if let's say we don't have a very effective vaccine, quite possible what will happen is COVID-19 will just become another common cold coronavirus. And it will enter, in circulation and just behave just like the other common cold coronaviruses. It's likely it will become milder and milder over also the years, because probably the evolutionary pressures will be against severity.
Yeah, because it kills off the host. It cannot jump from host to host, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So quite possible. And this is what we believe what happened with the other common cold coronaviruses. Whenever they entered, it's very likely they were severe, because they were really entering in a naive naive population. But over the time, of course, they become very normal. Yeah. So it's quite possible. Now, whether the vaccine may change this dynamics, this is what remains to be the question. I think if we have a very effective vaccine, I'm talking about very highly efficacious vaccine, and we can really scale it up quickly before really the virus mutate enough to make the vaccine less effective. We may have a chance to eliminate this infection globally. It may not be easy, but I think theoretically it's possible. And the kind of global response we see to this pandemic is different from any other infection. I mean, the world has learned its lesson.
I doubt that. We learn lessons and we forget them.
For this one, to be honest with you, I'm more on the optimistic side. The reason why, because I mean, I spent my career working on infections that affect the poor.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult to really, to fight for these because it doesn't affect really the rich people.
Right.
This pandemic is different. It really, I mean, if you think of it, any capitalist in this world will see this pandemic as a real enemy because it caused massive economic losses that the world has never seen, before. So I think that the economic incentive to fight this pandemic is very, very different from all other actually epidemics. This is why I'm more on the optimistic side.
Okay.
And when there is an interest and there is an incentive, you can see miracles happen.
That's right. Yeah, like you said, technology is developing quite fast. So if you put your mind to it, we can solve this problem. What would you say, sort of the minimum threshold efficacy that is needed for the first vaccine or first group of vaccines to be useful? What's sort of the minimum threshold you would see?
Any value for the efficacy will be useful. But of course, what we want is sufficient efficacy to reach herd immunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here, I would say we need 60 to 80%, somewhere over there, in order really to have a minimal chance of being able to reach herd immunity and to control infection transmission.
Okay. So that is where the typical flu vaccine comes out at also, right? About 60 to 80% every year.
Oh, it's even quite often significantly less than that.
Oh, less than
Sometimes
that.
it's actually, sometimes even below 50%. For the influenza vaccine, it's they try to produce it before actually they know exactly the circulating strain. So it's a hit and miss situation, So they count on cross reactivity. Right. But here, no. Here, actually, we know the virus, and it doesn't look like it's mutating rapidly.
Okay.
So I think we have a better chance.
Yeah, so that's what I want to ask you. So from an evolutionary perspective, if we get an effective vaccine, will that drive mutations? Will that drive evolution? Will that drive more potent strains to to appear in the future? What do we know about that?
Well, clearly it will create an evolutionary pressure. So there will be evolutionary pressure for the vaccine to evade, for the evolutionary pressure on the virus to evade the vaccine.
Yeah.
So it could, I mean, in principle. Now, but again, I mean, fortunately for this virus, it does not look like it's mutating rapidly.
Yeah.
This is, I think, it's really encouraging. I mean, we have seen one big mutation that's actually becoming dominant, which is this 614 mutation. But really, that's more the exception rather than the rule. I mean, again, I don't have that background. I'm more an epidemiologist, but to my understanding, it does not look like it's actually evolving quickly.
Okay, that is encouraging. So I want to finish up with your paper on re-exposure, and there has been a lot of talk around this, and it has a variety of implications, both vaccination as well as further policy interventions. So again, Qatar data, what does it tell us about the possibility of reinfections?
Yeah, so we are fortunate here because it's a small country.
Yeah.
And we have everything centralized, and we have universal healthcare system for everyone. So we have all the data on COVID-19 in one place. So we can dig into this data and really look for a lot of things. So one of the things we looked into is this issue of reinfection. We know everyone who got infected and has a laboratory confirmed diagnosis. So we followed them to see whether they actually got reinfected. And the result was we did find evidence for reinfection in just over 50 cases.
Yeah.
So we went also and tried to do viral genome sequencing for a proportion of them where we managed to get actually paired samples, original infection and reinfection. And we discovered indeed some of them got reinfected. There is no question that we had reinfections in our epidemic. But this is not really the important finding.
Yeah.
The really important finding was calculating this risk of reinfection,
Yeah.
which turned out to be very, very low. It's actually 10 in 10,000, or an incidence rate that's actually less than 1 per 10,000 person weeks. So we're talking about really, really rare events. That's this reinfection.
Any difference
Yeah.
on the prognosis of the reinfected people? I know that sample set is very small, but do we know anything?
Uh, we know all the reinfections
Yeah.
were actually mild. None of them was severe, critical, or fatal. None of them.
Okay.
Which actually makes sense, because we would think somebody who is getting reinfected, they already have an immune response that could help them
Right.
clear the infection. Yeah. But again, as you indicated, it's a small sample, so we cannot be conclusive. Maybe it's just we don't have enough sample,
Yeah.
because really our severity is also very, very low to begin with here.
Right, right. Do we know it is reinfection or reactivation? Just like the chicken pox organism, so it stays in the body for a while and then comes back again. Is it really reinfection? Again, probably tough to say in small
No,
samples. Yeah.
for in our case,
Yeah.
we definitely can tell
Yeah.
that some of them were definitely reinfections, because the virus that was sequenced, the first virus and the second virus, were actually different. I mean, in fact, in all 4 cases for which we have very conclusive evidence for reinfection, all of them, even the first virus, had one mutation that did not exist in the second one.
Okay.
So it's very, very clearly these are 2 different viruses.
So generally speaking, you would say people were worried about reinfection, but just looking at the probability of that happening and the much better prognosis, even if you get reinfected, it's not really a concern, again, from a policy perspective.
Up to now.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how long is immunity will last. But at least the data is pretty clear within actually at least the 4 months, because we did the follow-up for 4 months in that study.
Right.
Clearly, we do not see really, it's very, very rare event. Now, but how long this will last, we don't know. For some of the common cold viruses, it appears that immunity lasts only for about a year. For SARS, it appears it actually lasted for 3 years. We will see. I think this might be closer to SARS, probably, than it is for the common cold viruses. But this remains to be seen.
So that's something that we have to determine, and that will then drive sort of the vaccine frequency.
Yeah, of course. Yes, definitely. But even before that, I think this is really quite very encouraging finding for the vaccine.
Yeah.
So this is why actually I'm really very optimistic that we will have a vaccine soon. Because if we see that the immune system has no problem in confronting the infection, clearing the infection from the body, and having sustained immunity for at least few months, that's actually very encouraging also that the vaccine will work. This is not HIV. Right. I mean, my basic work is much of it is in HIV. HIV, the immune system never manages to clear the infection. So no wonder why we are having hard time developing a vaccine. But this is not the case here.
Right, right.
I think this is more really standard infection where there is very strong immunity, it looks like.
Yeah, that's encouraging. So in conclusion, then, Laith, we went through a pandemic. We did some things wrong. We didn't quite understand it early enough. The interventions were highly varied across the countries. We didn't really have a worldwide coordinated response. So hopefully we learn a lot from our mistakes. But if there were another strain behind it, maybe not next year, but a few years down the road, based on your experience and what we have seen in Qatar, as a lab experiment, what would be sort of the top 2, 3 things that you would say that we should do once we identify something like this happening?
Mhm. Rapid action.
Yeah.
I mean, really, where we failed here is in not appreciating what many have been saying for years. The fact that the pandemic happened is not surprising at all.
Yeah.
We know this was going to happen. I mean, there is no question, because this has been happening for all human history. I mean, and now even there are stronger reasons for it to happen, given how connected the whole world has come together. So this has happened, this will continue to happen. But clearly, this is where rapid action is very, very important. We have to have very strong global surveillance systems.
Yeah.
And train teams everywhere to how to confront and isolate such an outbreak quickly. This is really the best chance. I mean, imagine now if, let's say, China acted quickly over, once they discovered the infection, and they had a system already in place for very rapid action. Probably we will never know that SARS, that this COVID-19 was destined to be what it was. Because, in fact, nobody would have probably known about it. All what they know, oh, well, there was this outbreak and China contained it,
Yeah,
But of course,
yeah.
yeah.
No, I was just wondering though, just like you said, Laith, in 2020, we have 8.4 billion people, and you can get from one part of the world to another in 16 hours. And there are a lot of people doing that,
Of
and
course.
so it seems to me that one of the issues I saw, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we didn't have a coordinated response, right? So I don't think something like this, if it were to occur in the future, just one country will be sufficient. So, like you say, there has to be a worldwide surveillance system, and when something raises a red flag, it has to be a coordinated response by all countries, not just one, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, this is where, honestly, I see an opportunity for this pandemic.
Yeah.
Why? Because this is the first time humanity has faced such an acute global challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, we have lots of global challenges, like, global warming and so on. But so acutely, this is the first time. So maybe it's really a lesson also. Global challenges needs a global response. It's very simple.
Right.
You know,
Right.
could this pandemic be an agent for change, where we start really thinking we really need to work all together to confront really the global problems?
Is it an agency like WHO, or would you suggest sort of redesigning the whole system?
WHO, of course, would be a great agency to lead this effort. But really, I mean, I work with the WHO. I'm director of WHO Collaborating Center here. WHO, people expect much for WHO, but they don't empower WHO.
Right.
I mean, we cannot expect something from WHO if we are not empowering them. I mean, the WHO have huge responsibilities, but they don't have sufficient resources
Right.
for these challenges. So I think we need to empower the WHO more. We need also to really everyone to work with the WHO. I mean, lots of countries have the ability to work with WHO. I mean, here, in fact, our collaboration center is one example to this. We are a collaborating center with WHO, but we are independent from WHO. We do our research, which gets fed into WHO and support WHO mission.
Yeah.
And this could be a model for many other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, it has to rise to the status of the United Nations, because these threats are potentially much more severe threats in the future. And so, like you say, resourcing, empowering a world agency that can, do things without the constraints of whatever political regime is in place, one place or the other. We cannot control that. But there has to be, some way to for a world agency to step up and really both do the surveillance as well as when it identifies something, take actions without any constraints.
Yeah, definitely we need a much stronger response than what happened.
Yeah. Hopefully we learn from it. This has been great, Laith. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me on a weekend. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure to have this very interesting and rich discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.